Good morning. I'm guessing y'all might be here to see Kresser. Yes. Okay. Well, he is the creator of Kresser.com and Revolution Health Radio. He's the co-director and the president of the California Center for Functional Medicine and the New York Times best-selling author of The Paleo Cure. Please welcome Kresser.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's good to see you here. And how about a round of applause for Keith and Michelle and the whole crew at Paleo Effects for putting this together. Fantastic. All right, so this is a box of pH strips, and it measures the pH, or the acidity, of bodily fluids like saliva and urine. And proponents of the acid-alkaline hypothesis hold that this simple tool, which you can get for about 6 cents a strip if you buy them in bulk, holds the key to promoting health and preventing disease, and provides the basis for advocating vegetarian and vegan diets and avoiding animal products. Now, the basic theory here is illustrated on this slide, which is that if you consume acid-forming foods and beverages, you'll be sick, and if you consume alkaline foods and beverages, you will be healthy. So it's a compelling theory on the surface. pH is pretty easy to measure with the strips that I just mentioned. And it turns out that most people that are eating an industrialized Western diet do have slightly acidic urine, and that eating alkaline foods will actually raise the pH of the urine or saliva, which means lower the acidity or alkalize it. So this is satisfying for people. It's, you see these objective and measurable changes quickly, and it feeds into our American obsession with instant gratification. It also explains the entire industry we've seen now of products that have grown up around this hypothesis, from supplements to water to alkalizing water drops. There's a whole range of books that are, have been published and are still being published on this hypothesis. Electronic guides, food charts. We've got information products, and of course, a whole range of websites. And you'll even see references to it in the scientific literature, although in a much more refined version, which I'm going to talk more about later. So just a quick poll, show of hands. How many have heard of the acid-alkaline hypothesis? Okay, so most of the people here in this room. How many of you at one point believed that it was true? Show of hands, don't be shy. All right. And how many of you still believe that it's true? This is the hardest one. Put your hand up, come on. All right. So again, it's a compelling theory. It's popular, it makes sense on the surface, and it's captured the attention and changed the behavior of literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people around the world. There's only one problem. It's a myth. So how could so many people be so wrong? Well, it turns out that's not that unusual when you look at the history of science. At one point, everybody thought the world was flat, right? And that the sun revolved around the earth. As recently as a few hundred years ago, or 100 years ago really, mercury was used as a cure for just about everything, from the common cold to malaria. Little did we know we were poisoning ourselves. Just a few decades ago, doctors and everybody in the medical establishment insisted that ulcers were exclusively caused by stress. And it wasn't until a couple of young physicians came up with the idea that, or observed that people with ulcers had a bacterium called H. pylori, that paradigm changed. This was only very recent. So let's remember, majority does not always rule. As Anatole France said, even if 50 million people say a foolish thing, it is still a foolish thing. So there's three basic claims of the acid-alkaline hypothesis. Number one is that what we eat and drink directly affects the pH, or the acidity, of our blood. Number two is that urine pH is an accurate indicator of our overall health, and a corollary of that is that urine pH is an adequate reflector of the pH of our blood. And number three is that acidic acid-forming diets contribute to all manner of chronic inflammatory disease. So this is a video that's representative of the first claim that what we eat directly affects the pH of our blood. And I don't mean to pick on this particular person. There's hundreds of videos like this on YouTube, but it will give you the idea here.
You may have heard about acidic versus alkaline foods. Well, our bodies like to stay in a very narrow range of pH balance. That means acidity versus alkalinity. And our bodies don't like to get out of that range very far. What happens if you get too acidic is you start to become very inflamed, your organs don't work as well, you don't think as well, you may feel pain more and faster. So you want to stay more alkaline than acidic. Unfortunately, our modern diets are filled with acidic foods. Some of those acidic foods are processed, refined carbohydrates like white flour and sugar. Dairy products can be very acidic. Animal foods can be very acidic, whether it's meat or eggs, especially if you have an egg allergy. Other acidic foods can be fruits and vegetables. Most fruits and vegetables are more alkaline. But some of the vegetables and fruits that are more acidic, and again, it depends on the person, but some people find citrus fruits to be very acidic, or tropical fruits, things like mangoes, papaya, pineapple, those can cause an acidic response in some people. So you want to focus more on having alkaline foods in your diet. Those are things like green leafy vegetables, whole grains, most fruits and vegetables. Those are going to help your body stay in that acid-alkaline balance and calm the resulting inflammation, and you're going to feel a lot better.
Okay, so that's the first claim. I'm going to show you a shorter video that's representative of the second claim, which is your urine pH is representative of the pH of your blood and overall health.
Hi, David here to talk about our newly improved diagnostic pH test strip. Now, one of the most common questions I get from people is, how do I know if I'm acidic or not? And the answer is simple. You're going to test your urine first thing in the morning. If it's below 6.5, then you're acidic. If you're in the 4.5 to 5 range, you're really acidic. But at least then you'll know what steps you have to take in order to correct that and get your body into balance.
Okay, so that's the claim, that's the basic hypothesis that we're looking at here. But before I go into those three claims, I want to talk just briefly about some basics. First is, what is pH and acid balance? Well, as I said, the pH is a measure of the acidity of a liquid. And you can see here, this is the pH scale. So 7 is neutral, and that would be something like distilled water. And then as you go to the left on the scale, lower, it's more acidic. And if you go to the right on the scale, you're talking about more alkaline things. And the pH scale is logarithmic, which means that a difference of 1 on the pH scale is a 10-fold difference in the acidity of a liquid. So the pH of our blood is slightly alkaline, 7.4, and even a slight change in this pH can have serious and potentially fatal consequences. And in fact, it's so important that the body has 3 mechanisms for maintaining pH in a very narrow range in the blood. And the first is a series of buffers in the blood's plasma that can compensate for any changes that might happen in the pH of the blood. The second is the lungs. So carbon dioxide is the most prevalent acid in the body by far, and it's a byproduct of normal cellular activity. So when the blood carries carbon dioxide to the lungs, and then we exhale that carbon dioxide. So that's the primary means of eliminating acid in the body, and it works very well, and it happens very quickly. The third mechanism is the kidney. The kidneys filter out excess acid from the blood and eliminate them through the urine, and this happens more slowly than the acid elimination through the lungs and exhalation, but it still is a significant source of acid elimination. So the proponents of the acid-alkaline hypothesis do get some things right. It's true that food is metabolized into end products called ash, and it's true that ash can be acidic or alkaline, and it's true that proteins, particularly animal proteins, grains, sulfur and phosphorus-rich foods are primarily acidic, And it's true that fruits and vegetables, particularly green vegetables, and foods that are rich in calcium or magnesium or potassium primarily produce an alkaline ash. So now that we've got the basics out of the way, let's look at those three claims. The first, as you recall, is that what we eat and drink directly affects the pH of our blood. So all of the enzymes in the body function only in a very narrow range of blood pH. And any significant change in pH, like below 7 or above 7.7, means almost certain death. And this is why the body so tightly regulates blood pH in that narrow range with these multiple and redundant systems that we've been talking about. Our survival literally depends on this. So it doesn't make any sense that we could change our blood pH with something as simple as diet. There are many examples of cultures and also periods of time where our access to food has been highly restricted and we were limited to a very narrow range of food choices. You have cultures like the traditional Inuit and the Maasai who consume a very large percentage of their total calories as animal products. Now, if the acid-alkaline hypothesis were true, these cultures would have never survived, and arguably humanity would have never survived. Now, you can change the pH of your blood with sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, but not without making yourself very sick. So I definitely wouldn't try this at home. There are some health conditions like metabolic acidosis, which involve altered blood pH, but these are caused by things like chronic kidney failure or rhabdomyolysis, which is a rapid breakdown of skeletal muscle tissue, not by what we eat. I haven't been able to find a single well-designed study in a reputable peer-reviewed journal that suggests that what we eat directly affects the pH of our blood. And if you look in any medical textbook, this is just basic physiology. Now, the second claim is that the pH of our urine is an accurate indicator of our overall health and an indicator of our blood pH. It's true that the urine of people on a Western diet tends to be slightly acidic, but this more acid in the urine doesn't necessarily mean that there's more acid in the blood. It means that the kidney is doing its job of eliminating excess acid. So the pH of our urine is really more of a reflection of metabolic and digestive processes and not a reflection of the pH of our blood. So the third claim is that acid-forming diets contribute to all manner of chronic inflammatory modern disease. And this is going to take a little bit more time to unpack, and so I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about it, or most of it. And we're going to use the acid-ash theory of osteoporosis as an example because it's one of the most prevalent arguments for an alkaline diet. So the acid-ash theory of osteoporosis is more nuanced than the idea that what we eat directly affects our blood pH, and it is actually addressed at length in the scientific literature. So the basic concept is that eating acidic foods does not change our blood pH directly, but it does require our body to pull minerals like calcium out of the bone in order to buffer the acids and keep the pH of the blood in a very narrow range. And over time, if you do that enough, if you're eating a net acidic diet, over time, you will eventually start to cause bone demineralization and osteoporosis. So again, this is more reasonable than the idea that what we eat or drink directly affects our blood pH, but it ignores the very important role that the kidney plays in all of this. So when proteins are digested, the acids that are produced in the digestive process are buffered by bicarbonate ions that are made by the kidneys. This reaction produces carbon dioxide, which is then carried to the lungs and exhaled, as we talked about earlier. And then it also produces salts, which are excreted by the kidneys. And during the process of excreting these salts, the kidneys make new bicarbonate ions that replace what were the ones that were used to buffer the acids before. And this represents a sustainable cycle whereby the lungs and the kidneys can maintain a stable pH in the blood without involving the bones or any of the minerals in the bones at all. But what about clinical trials? What do they say? Well, at first glance, if you just do a cursory search of the literature, you might think that they support the acid-alkaline hypothesis, because you do see studies that show that eating acidic foods causes higher levels of calcium in the urine. And researchers perhaps naturally assumed that this calcium was coming from the bone, was being withdrawn from the bone. The problem is this assumption didn't really play out. In a meta-analysis of studies in 2009, 5 very high-quality studies, researchers did find a positive association between acid in the urine, the amount of acid in the urine, and the amount of calcium in the urine. But, and this is the key point, there was no association between the amount of acid in the urine and calcium levels in the body. So if we put it more simply, eating more protein causes you to pee out more acid and calcium, but the overall amount of calcium in your body, which is the important factor, of course, doesn't change. So how is that possible? Well, it turns out that eating more animal protein actually improves calcium absorption. So this has been shown in well-controlled human isotope trials where they label calcium and are able to track it as it moves through the body. So the figure on the left here shows that as protein intake increases from 1 gram per kilogram to 2.1 grams per kilogram each day, you do see an increase in the amount of calcium that's excreted in the urine. That's represented by the bars moving up from the left to the right. But you also see that across that same increase in protein intake from 1 to 2 grams per kilogram, you also see a corresponding increase in the rate of intestinal calcium absorption, which compensates for any calcium that is lost through the urine, and overall calcium levels in the body either don't change or they actually even go up in cases where people are eating animal protein. And this probably explains why protein is almost universally associated with beneficial impacts on bone health in observational studies. So instead of using intermediate marker like calcium for bone health, there are many studies that have looked at protein's effect on things like bone mass, bone microarchitecture, and bone strength. And in a meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition of over 60 of these studies, there was a positive association, a strong positive association between protein intake and bone health. Conversely, in controlled trials where they've experimentally caused protein deficiency, so they deprive people of protein so that they're not getting enough, you see a deterioration of bone mass, microarchitecture, and strength, which are the 3 hallmarks of osteoporosis. So why is protein so important for bone health? It turns out there are at least 3 mechanisms that we know of. Number 1 is that protein contains all of the essential amino acids that we need for bone. Number 2 is that protein increases levels of insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1, which has 2 primary benefits for bone health. It increases bone mass and it increases bone growth. And number 3 is that higher protein intake leads to lower levels of parathyroid hormone. And we know that high levels of parathyroid hormone draw calcium out of the bones and cause low bone mineral density, high bone turnover, and a high risk of fractures, which are also hallmarks of osteoporosis. So animal protein plays an especially important role in bone health. Studies have shown that changes in muscle mass track together with changes in bone mass, which means that what's good for muscle is good for bone. And leucine is an amino acid that signals that protein is available for muscle synthesis, and animal proteins contain high amounts of leucine, so this suggests that leucine probably plays an important role in bone health as well. Observational studies show that a high intake of animal protein is associated with increased bone mineral density and decreased hip fracture, and this is especially true in the elderly. On the other hand, eating less meat and more plant protein is associated with worse bone health, and there's a negative association between protein and bone mineral density in both sexes, and elderly women that are eating a vegetarian diet have a higher risk of osteoporosis. Randomized clinical trials have shown that protein benefits bone health. In postmenopausal women here, the triangles on the top here, the top line, increasing protein from 10% of total calories to 20% of total calories improved calcium absorption, and it also decreased levels of something called urinary DPD, which is a marker of bone breakdown, and it increased IGF-1 levels, which, as we just saw on a previous slide, have two strong benefits for bone health. Now, it is true that some studies show that eating fruits and vegetables are associated with better bone health, but there's no evidence to suggest that that benefit comes from the alkaline properties of these foods. In fact, studies have been done that have shown that the improvement that occurs when you eat fruits and vegetables with bone health is independent of their alkalinity or their potassium content. So this suggests that there's something else about fruits and vegetables that causes them to benefit bone health, and that's completely plausible given the nutrient profile of fruits and vegetables. Now, finally, in a really exhaustive review that was published in the Nutrition Journal in 2011, they reviewed 55 trials. 22 of them were randomized clinical trials. The conclusion was very clear. A causal association between dietary acid load and osteoporotic bone disease is not supported by the evidence, and there is no evidence that an alkaline diet is protective of bone health. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about another claim that's often made by proponents of the acid-alkaline hypothesis, which is that acid-forming diets contribute to cancer. And you often see things like this on the internet. Every single person who has a cancer has a pH that's too acidic, and it's even attributed to Dr. Otto Warburg, who is a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, to give it that extra bit of credibility. Holistic cancer centers that promote vegan, vegetarian, raw diets make these claims, and the basic idea that they promote is that cancer only grows in an acidic environment, and that if you eat a net alkaline diet, you will be reducing your risk of cancer, or maybe even able to cure it if you already have cancer. Of course, this hypothesis depends on the idea that what we eat and drink will directly affect our blood pH, which we've just seen as false. Moreover, cancer is entirely capable of growing in an alkaline environment. The normal pH of the blood, as I said, is 7.4, and virtually all experiments that have been done with cancer cells have been performed in this alkaline environment, normal human blood in vitro studies. So it's entirely possible and normal for cancer to grow in an alkaline environment. It is true that cancer grows better in an acidic environment, but here the causality is reversed. You don't get cancer because your blood is acidic. Your blood becomes more acidic when you have cancer. That's a very important distinction to understand. And this is actually what Dr. Otto Warburg won the Nobel Prize for discovering. Acidity is a byproduct of cancer cell metabolism. So malignant tumors take in glucose just like normal cells, but the way that they process glucose for energy production is different, and it leads to higher levels of lactic acid and carbon dioxide, which are both acids, in the blood. But elevated lactic acid and carbon dioxide don't cause cancer. If they did, everybody who exercises a lot or holds their breath a lot would have cancer, because holding your breath increases carbon dioxide and exercise increases lactic acid. So high carbon dioxide and lactic acid are the result of cancerous cells, not the cause. So here we are at PaleoFX. We're interested in evolutionary biology and nutrition. What does the evolutionary data tell us about this question? I've found that the evolutionary data can be a helpful way of resolving an apparent conflict in modern clinical research, and this is no exception. So we see, when we look at the data, that there was a large review of 230 contemporary hunter-gatherer cultures that found that 68% of their food intake was animal protein, animal product, and 32% was plant-based. So that would suggest that most hunter-gatherers follow a net acid-forming diet. We had another review that found that well over 50% of hunter-gatherers do eat a net acid-forming diet. They look specifically at the acid-alkaline properties of their diets. So if the acid-alkaline hypothesis were true, we should see massive bone problems in our ancestors, which would certainly show up in the archaeological record, and we would expect to see rampant chronic inflammatory disease in contemporary hunter-gatherers. That's exactly the opposite of what we see. The archaeological record shows very robust bone health in our ancestors and dental health, and studies of contemporary hunter-gatherers by people like Dr. Stefan Lindeberg have shown almost a complete absence of chronic inflammatory disease in these cultures. Dr. Weston Price, who many of you I'm sure have heard of, who is a dentist who studied traditional cultures around the world, he looked at the incidence of cavities in non-industrial populations who were eating net acid-forming diets and found that they were 5 to 100 times lower than the incidence of cavities of people eating Western diets that were neutral in their acid-alkaline balance. His theory, which I think has merit, was that the better dental health of these traditional populations had nothing to do with the acidity or alkalinity of their diet and everything to do with their intake of fat-soluble vitamins like A and D and K2, and also minerals and activators. Dr. Price said this about 100 years ago: "Our bodies have a mechanism for maintaining proper acid and alkali balance in the blood, and this varies through only a very narrow limit whether the balance of the total food eaten is acid or alkaline." It is my belief that much harm has been done through the misconception that acidity and alkalinity were something apart from minerals and other elements. So Price was quite a pioneer in many ways, and this is no exception. Price's comments lead us to an important question, which is, okay, so let's say we accept that there's nothing to this acid-alkaline hypothesis, and eating alkaline diets are not beneficial, but could they actually be harmful? And the biggest risk here is that when you carry the acid-alkaline hypothesis through to its logical conclusion or extreme, you end up on a vegetarian or vegan diet, because a lot of the acid-forming foods are animal products, and so if you're trying to be as alkaline as possible, you're pretty much going to avoid most or all animal products. And the risk here is with nutrient deficiency. So we have many studies now that have shown that vegetarians and vegans tend to be deficient in a wide range of nutrients that we need for health, from B12 to calcium to iron to zinc to vitamins A and D to the long-chain omega-3 fats like EPA and DHA. And this is especially true when studies use newer techniques for detecting deficiency. So this slide here shows the prevalence of B12 deficiency among omnivores, vegans, and vegetarians. And the researchers in this study used two markers called holotranscobalamin and methylmalonic acid for detecting B12 deficiency. And this is important because these markers are far more sensitive for detecting B12 deficiency than serum B12, which was used in the past. And when these markers are used, as you can see, there's a dramatic difference in B12 levels. Fully 83% of vegans are B12 deficient, 68% of vegetarians, versus just 5% of omnivores. So again, that's not an insignificant difference. On paper, calcium intake is similar in omnivores and vegetarians, but it tends to be much lower in vegans who are often deficient. But another important issue to consider here is bioavailability. So compounds like oxalic acid and phytic acid are present in dark leafy green vegetables, and they inhibit calcium absorption. So even though on paper things like spinach and kale are high in calcium, you may not absorb as much calcium as you would think from those foods because of the oxalic acid and phytic acid content. So that's really a crucial thing to keep in mind when we're talking about nutrient balance across these different populations. Likewise with zinc, overt deficiency is pretty rare in vegetarians and even vegans, but intake often falls well below recommendations. And the more subtle ways of detecting zinc deficiency aren't typically being used in these studies. Just a little anecdote from my practice. I use organic acids urine testing and some other more advanced testing that look at processes in the body that involve zinc as an important cofactor. And I will often see a breakdown in these processes which suggests that there's a functional or active zinc deficiency even when the serum levels of zinc are normal. So I think zinc deficiency is actually a lot more widespread than is being picked up by these studies. And as with calcium and B12, there is definitely a bioavailability issue with zinc. Studies have shown that vegetarian diets reduce zinc absorption by 35% compared to omnivorous diets, and that on average, vegetarians may have to consume about 50% more zinc than omnivores to attain the same blood levels because of the bioavailability issue. Vitamin D is found almost exclusively in animal foods, and it's especially important since many of us spend a lot of time indoors now or live in far northern or southern latitudes. This slide shows the average intake of vitamin D per day in micrograms, and as you can see, it's about 41% lower in vegetarians and 71% lower in vegans. Other studies have shown that serum levels of vitamin D are 58% lower in vegetarians and 71% lower in vegans. Now this slide shows the proportion of DHA, which is an important long-chain fatty acid, as a percentage of total fatty acids in the serum. And again, vegetarians have a 30% lower concentration of DHA, and vegans have nearly 60% lower concentration of DHA. So nutrient deficiency is no small thing. Micronutrients are required by enzymes that govern pretty much all aspects of bodily function. And while nutrient deficiency rarely leads to death in this day and age, it certainly did in the past, things like scurvy and rickets, but today it rarely gets that far. What's important to understand is that it can lead to a whole range of symptoms, from mild symptoms like fatigue to insomnia to mood imbalance to more serious conditions like neuropathy, infertility, cardiovascular disease, and dementia. And quite ironically, osteoporosis and poor bone health, especially in the elderly. So here you have, the proponents of the acid-alkaline hypothesis suggesting that we consume a diet that is associated, in order to improve our bone health, and most of the research shows that it's actually associated with worse bone health. So some people have asked me, hey, if there's nothing to this acid-alkaline hypothesis, why did I feel so much better when I started, alkalizing or eating an alkaline diet? Well, there are a couple answers for that. Number one is that it depends where you're coming from, right? So if you're eating a standard American diet with cheese doodles and big gulps and Twinkies, and you switch to an alkaline diet, what's happening there? You're decreasing your intake of processed and refined junk food. You're decreasing your intake of flour and gluten, which many people are sensitive to. You're decreasing your intake of sugar. You're decreasing your intake of dairy products, which I think can be healthy when they're well tolerated, but a lot of people are sensitive to the proteins and the sugars. And then you're dramatically increasing your intake of fresh fruit and fresh vegetables, especially green vegetables. So of course that person is going to feel better, but it doesn't have anything to do with the acidity or alkalinity of those foods. And that argument can be extended, as I said on the previous slide where I said bone health does improve when you eat fruits and vegetables. That's true, but again, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the acidity or alkalinity of those foods. So I'd like to pause now for a few minutes and take some questions, and then I'm going to circle back and I have a few more slides to finish the presentation, and if there's more time, I'll answer a few more questions. There's a gentleman right here. There it is. Thank you.
So you mentioned that
Hold it right up to your mouth. There you go.
protein intake increases IGF-1, but I've seen studies mentioning that IGF-1 is linked to cancer. Is that a concern to have regarding proteins, or?
Good question. I don't think that research is very compelling. When you look at protein intake overall, you know, the challenge with all of this stuff is to get too focused on mechanisms and ignore the bigger picture. So when we look at protein intake overall, is it associated with cancer? It may be if the intake, and this is, apologize, getting a little bit, you know, beyond what we're talking about now. If you eat a lot of lean muscle protein without glycine-rich, you know, bone broth, fats, collagen, things like that, I think there is some research that suggests that higher protein intake is linked to cancer. But when you have, you know, a well-balanced diet that includes those other foods, there's no convincing evidence that I've seen that links IGF-1 or protein to cancer. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Hello?
Yep.
Hi. First of all, Chris, I came from Brazil just to meet you.
Oh,
so
thank you.
It's a
Thank
pleasure
you so
to
much.
meet you. We are having a problem right now in Brazil because the Paleo diet was introduced as a diet
Right.
and very low carb and
Right.
keto and so on. So we are having a lot of people that are becoming ill because of the approach that
Right.
they are having on the diet. But this is something else. I would love to talk to you about it later.
It's like I might
But
have
my
to come to
question,
Brazil.
yeah, my question right now would be about vitamin D.
Yeah.
We have a very famous doctor in Brazil that has a protocol, and he, in the protocol, he uses 100,000 units per week.
Wow.
In the patients. And this was 1 week ago or 2 weeks ago in a very famous magazine, health magazine, saying that this guy was treating autoimmune disease because of the vitamin D and utilizing very high doses of this vitamin.
Yeah.
So this was a huge concern because Brazilians are 99% of Brazilians are deficient in this vitamin.
Yeah.
But we know that we don't need that much.
Right.
And now there's this doctor saying that, oh, hey, we are deficient, and that's the reason for our autoimmune disease. And so he launched the protocol with 100,000 units per week. So
Bad.
I would like to know your concern about it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. I mean, most nutrients follow a U-shaped curve. So that's scientific lingo which means you don't want too much and you don't want too little. There are a few nutrients that don't seem to really have an upper end for the toxicity range, like B12. But vitamin D is certainly toxic at high levels. And you know, it's potentially dangerous. I see patients who come to my clinic, they were put on a supplement of vitamin D of even just 5,000 units a day. And that was 5 years ago, and the doctor never followed up and tested their D levels, and they were never told to stop taking it. And I test their D levels, and they're 110, and guess what? They have kidney stones. And that, you know, that's one of the primary effects you'd expect from high levels of vitamin D. And then I send them for a calcium score, which is a test that measures the calcification of your arteries, and they're young people who have a high calcium score in their arteries. So, and that's another effect that you could see from excess vitamin D supplementation. So, you know, it's always best to get nutrients from food when possible. Vitamin D is one of those that sometimes we do need to supplement with, but my recommendation is to keep it in a range of about 25 to 50 and test your blood levels to see if you're in that range. You can't just guess, because we already know now that there are many factors which affect vitamin D absorption, from genetic mutations to digestive capacity to inflammation and obesity, decrease the conversion of sunlight to vitamin D, and they also decrease our absorption of vitamin D. So there's no way of being able to recommend one dose to everybody, no matter what that dose is, and I would certainly be extremely concerned about a dose of 100,000 units. Yeah.
Hi, Chris.
Hi. Where are
Over
you?
here.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Hey. I'm a functional medicine practitioner from San Mateo, California. So,
Across the bay.
that's right, representing. My question is, I'm assuming that you don't get to see healthy vegetarians and vegans coming into your practice. So with the vegans or vegetarians that do come into your practice and are looking to address some sort of health issue, and you find through your testing that it may be clear that they really need to put some kind of animal foods back into their diet, how do you address that? How do you talk to them? Do you try and help them with a vegetarian or vegan approach to it, or do you say, look, this just isn't going to work unless you start adding some animals back into your diet? How do you address that?
It's a great question, and I'm gonna answer that, and I'm gonna also kind of answer a bigger question there, which is it possible to be a healthy vegetarian? Yes, I know vegetarians who are healthy by all measures that we have. And vegan, I think it's a lot more challenging, but if you supplement with all the nutrients that you're not getting through the diet, it is even possible to be a healthy vegan. I have friends and I know people that are maintaining seemingly good health on those diets, but it's just a lot harder, and you're setting yourself up for more difficulty, more challenge in terms of knowing what to supplement with, and not being able to get all of your nutrients from food that way. The other thing about that is we know it totally depends on the person. So if you hear about like some super athlete who's following a vegan diet and they're doing like ultra marathons and all that, and then you think that you can do that too, you might be mistaken, because there are, again, genetic mutations and all kinds of other environmental factors that affect our ability to convert nutrients that are found in plants, which are generally inactive, into the more active forms of the nutrients which we need to function. And so if you have someone who is really good at those conversions, they might be able to pull off a vegetarian or vegan diet. But if you have someone who's not very good at those conversions for any number of reasons, it will be a disaster for them. So the first thing is it really depends on the person. Second thing, like in answering your question, is I respect people's choices. I was a vegan and a macrobiotic vegan at one point for a while, which is kind of surprising. Maybe not. A lot of people in here maybe were at one time too. I was a vegetarian for a long time, and there are a lot of reasons for making that choice. But my job as a clinician is to provide them with the information that I have at my disposal, both in terms of the scientific literature and what we see there, and the rates of deficiency and health outcomes for vegetarians and vegans, and also what I'm seeing in their own lab work. And I just present it in a very matter-of-fact way. I say, this is what we're seeing, this is linked, this is almost certainly linked to you being a vegetarian or a vegan. My recommendation would be that you consume animal products. I have respect for your choices and why you've made this decision, but you're coming to me from my advice on how to improve your health, and this is my advice, and whether you take it or leave it is up to you. And I find that works very well in most cases. And sometimes people take that advice. Sometimes I have some patients who are of East Indian descent, and it's a religious thing for them and a cultural and family thing, and they just can't. They just don't want to eat animal products, at least they don't want to eat meat, but they can eat eggs and dairy products, so I'll get them doing that if it works well for them. So yeah, it really depends on the patient, but if you're coming from the right place and you respect their choices and you present it to them as a choice for them, it works pretty well. A couple more, and then I'll finish the presentation, and then we'll have time at the end again.
Given the limited pH of the blood, I've noticed historically for myself that if I supplement with higher doses of vitamin C or potentially drink excess amounts of like orange juice, I develop mouth ulcers, but if I stop that, they go away. Given that limited range, what would be the most likely cause of that situation?
Well, as I said, you definitely can change the pH of your mouth, of your saliva with what you eat, and the pH of your urine. You're not changing the pH of your blood. And I definitely think there's something to the pH of saliva affecting dental health and oral health. So, dental health isn't particularly a specialty of mine, but I know that there are now some specific dental probiotics like Bliss, BLIS K12, which you typically chew, and those are thought to have an effect on the pH of the saliva, and I know a lot of people are having a lot of benefit or experiencing a lot of benefits there. But if you consume those foods and they lead to poor outcomes in your mouth, I would say just don't consume less, regardless of what the cause is. Okay, one more.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, where are you?
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
I've got a question. I was diagnosed with osteoporosis probably at least a dozen years ago, and my mother had it, so I thought, genetically, that's what happened to me. My bone scans are steady, and I have been on the osteoporotic medication, Fosamax, and felt very uncomfortable on that due to the side effects, like the jaw necrosis and the femurs that just break.
Yeah.
So I am on a sabbatical from that for a while. But what my true question is, can one reverse it once you have it?
Yeah, I've definitely seen stabilization where there's no further decline, and I have seen some reversal. I think the two biggest things I look for with osteoporosis, inflammation is really, I think the primary cause of osteoporosis, not even nutrient balance or nutrient deficiency. And that's tricky because there are a lot of potential sources of inflammation. There can be things like small intestine bacterial overgrowth and all kinds of different gut issues, autoimmunity, heavy metal toxicity, any number of things that can cause inflammation. So you kind of have to go looking with like a good functional medicine provider for sources of inflammation. But number two, in Japanese studies, they've used very high doses of vitamin K2 to treat and prevent osteoporosis, up to 45 milligrams a day, which is, if you know K2, the doses are usually provided in micrograms, not milligrams. So that's a very high dose, but it's one of those nutrients that doesn't seem to have a upper limit that we've found yet for toxicity. And vitamin K2 regulates calcium metabolism, which means it makes sure that calcium gets into the bones and the teeth where it belongs, the hard structures of the body, and it keeps it out of the soft tissues. So in these studies, people did experience improvement in their bone density by taking these high doses of K2. So that would be something to explore with your doctor or functional medicine provider. Okay, so I'm going to finish just a few slides here in the presentation, and then if there is time, which someone will tell me, I'm sure I'll answer a few more questions. So despite weak evidence, this acid-alkaline hypothesis continues to flourish. We've got new books published all the time, new products, and experts still referring to it. Why is this? Well, as Mark Twain said, it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. And my favorite Upton Sinclair quote, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary is dependent upon him not understanding. So the good news is that, thanks, yeah, that's a good quote. It explains a lot. Thanks to the pioneering work of scientists like Dr. Price 100 years ago, who'd already figured this out, and more recent science published in the peer-reviewed literature, we know that the acid-alkaline hypothesis is false. So if you want to learn more about my work, it's Kresser.com. There's 2 articles there about the acid-alkaline hypothesis where I challenge this in written form, and it's got citations for all of the studies that I mentioned in the presentation and a lot more. And then you also find a number of free ebooks on subjects like gut health, thyroid, weight loss, low-carb diets, skin problems, and more. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate your presence, and thanks again to Keith and Michelle.